Okay, well, this is a relief map that shows basically the whole Cahokia site as we know it, and with some modern features interposed such as highways, etc. But at the center is Monk's Mound, which is not only the largest mound here at Cahokia, it's the largest prehistoric earthwork in all of the Americas. So in the Western Hemisphere, that's the largest totally earthen mound built by ancient people. It covers over 14 acres at the base. It's 100 feet high, has several different terraces or levels, and had a huge building on top, probably where the paramount chief would govern from, and then you meet with the council of elders and other visiting dignitaries. So this was sort of the royal palace. Maybe he lived there as well, it's hard to say, but it probably had multiple functions as a public governmental building and religious building as well. To the east of Monk's Mound is the stockade wall, and that was actually built several times, and it ran for almost 2 miles from where you see it here on the model, almost to the museum. It went behind the twin mounds, came around this direction, came past this mound. Not exactly sure where it is on this side yet. On the north side, we know at least one of the walls is turning to go behind Monk's Mound, so we assume the others did as well. So this is basically a fortification to protect the central ceremonial precinct, which included Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and about 17 other mounds. It was built, like I said, 4 times over about a 100-year period. First built around 1175 AD. Over the next 100 years, it was rebuilt as one wall became old and weak with age and decay. They built a new and stronger one and tear down the old one. It was basically to defend the central precinct. So it shows that warfare and conflict were an important part of Mississippian culture, especially here in Cahokia. We have no proof it was ever attacked, but the threat of attack was there long enough. They felt the need to keep rebuilding that wall. Out in front of Monk's Mound is the Grand Plaza. It covers about 40 acres and was actually artificially filled and leveled to make it a flat surface where they would have public gatherings, festivals, games, markets, and other kinds of special activities. Probably some of the more important people in their society lived around the edges of the Grand Plaza. There are also other plazas to the east. There's one here called the East Plaza, and one called the Ramey Plaza, the North Plaza. There was another one in here we call the West Plaza, and some smaller ones as well. Over here we have the Woodhenge, which was their sun calendar, basically a circle of posts that was used to observe the rising sun each morning as observed from the center post. The posts around the perimeter, especially on the east side, would mark the rising position of the sun at the summer solstice, spring and fall equinoxes, and the winter solstice. So it had basically a calendar function to tell the time of year and to schedule various ceremonies and rituals, throughout the annual cycle. It was actually built 5 different times at this location. The first one was over in this area. The smallest one was about 240 feet in diameter, had 24 posts. All the others were built in this general location. The next one had 36 posts. The one we've reconstructed here was the third one with 48 posts. It was 410 feet in diameter. The next one had 60 posts, and the final one was just an arc post on the east side. But if it had been a full circle, it would have been 72 posts. So we don't know exactly why, but they're increasing the number of posts each time, and increasing the diameter of the circle as well. Perhaps as they're including more festival dates, or including a larger sacred space to hold ceremonies associated with the calendar cycle. Perhaps as the population was increasing, they needed more room for people to gather out there. To the south of the Grand Plaza are the twin mounds, platform mound and conical mound. And we see these several places throughout the site. There's a smaller pair over here. There are other places where we see platform and conical mounds paired up. And we think in this case, the twin mound might be a mortuary complex. We haven't excavated those mounds, but we know from other Mississippian sites that more than likely the building on the flat top mound would be a charnel structure, a place where important people were prepared for burial, perhaps buried later in the conical mound adjacent to it. And to the further south, small ridgetop mound that you see there is Mound 72. And this is a very unusual mound in that it was oriented differently than the others. And you can see it sits at an angle, runs from the northwest to the southeast. And also we know from excavations there were 3 smaller mounds under that one. And those in turn covered some burial groups. Ritual burials, human sacrifices, people of high status, and various other types of combinations which we'll discuss in the exhibits a little bit later. So these are some of the major site features. Of all these mounds that you see here, about 120 originally over about a 6 square mile area. About 80 of those have survived today. Others have been destroyed by farming activity, housing subdivisions, discount stores, and other kinds of modern activity. So very little of the site has escaped some kind of alteration by modern man. Fortunately, the central core of about 70 mounds is now owned by the state of Illinois and has been protected as part of Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, which is managed by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Okay, behind me is our entrance mural, and it gives an idea of what sort of downtown Cahokia might look like. We're standing behind what are called the twin mounds here in the foreground. It's a platform mound, and to the left, far left, you can see the conical mound. And we have not excavated those 2 mounds, but we know from work at other sites that it's probably a mortuary complex. That the building on the platform mound here might have been what's we call a charnel structure, where bodies of important people were prepared or saved for burial until the proper time for burial, and perhaps buried in the conical mound adjacent to it. And beyond the twin mounds, we're looking across the Grand Plaza, which covers over 40 acres, and we're showing a chunky field in the middle. It's a game that was often played by the Mississippians and also by later Indians that we know from early documents how this game was played. Usually 2 men would compete on a prepared field. They'd roll this stone disc on its edge down the field and throw spears or lances to where they thought it would stop rolling. And whoever was closest to where it stopped would score points. A lot of wagering was involved. There were village champions, perhaps competitions between communities. So sort of the national sport for the Mississippians. At the north end of the plaza is, of course, Monk's Mound, the largest mound. And in the illustration here, we're showing stairs up the front. We have found evidence where we think stairs had been based on archaeological work that was done. But also on the top, we know there was a huge building over 100 feet long, about 50 feet wide, probably where the paramount chief governed from, perhaps where councils would meet and visiting dignitaries from other communities. And so it was sort of like the royal palace, you might say. And on the first terrace across the front, to the left side, there was a small mound that was built and rebuilt several times. I think that first terrace was a late addition to the front of the mound, and perhaps as a result of slumping problems on the other sides, they wanted to reinforce the front of the mound and move some of the activity down to that lower level. So there's probably a small temple on that mound on the corner.
Hello.
And we know it was built at least and rebuilt about 8 or 9 times, but there originally had been some other buildings there which had burned, or probably burned in a ritual, and then the mound was built over them, and the building on top of that mound at each building stage. Out in the plaza are a couple mounds. Out in front of Monk's Mound is a ridgetop mound. So there were some excavations there by University of Oklahoma back in the 1990s. And they could see that originally it had been a small platform mound that was later made into a ridgetop mound. The other mound out in the plaza, we know now has another lower terrace facing toward Monk's Mound that would have had a building on top of it too. So most of the mounds here are that type of mound. They're rectangular flat top mounds that had structures on them, ceremonial buildings, the homes of the leaders, temples, if you want to call them that, or other kinds of public buildings. And around the plaza were other kinds of activities. We can see, in this case, they're kind of showing a market activity. Probably every so many years they might have festivals here at Cahokia, and people would come from many surrounding communities to trade and exchange items, and probably have all kinds of rituals going on as well as the games. So the plaza was sort of the heart of the city. It was probably as important to them as the mounds were. And we know that they artificially built this plaza up as much as 3 feet to level it. Originally this was kind of a ridge and swale topography in this land, so they filled in the low spots, knocked off high spots, brought more soil, sort of a sandier soil in for the surface, and so they're creating this, again, another type of sacred space within their city. Then around the perimeter of the plaza, you see the stockade wall or palisade. This is a defensive wall, again, that ran for almost 2 miles around the central part of the community, and it was built at least 4 times over about a 100-year period between 1175 to 1275 AD. And about every 90 feet along the wall they had bastions that project outward. These would have raised platforms in them where the warriors could stand to shoot arrows out against anybody attacking or catch them in a crossfire between towers. So it shows that warfare and conflict were common during the Mississippian period, but not at the beginning, because when Cahokia first was established, maybe around 1000 to 1050 AD, they did not have a wall. It wasn't until, like I said, around 1175 or so that they started building this wall. And we see a lot of other Mississippian sites being fortified as well. So people lived inside and people lived outside the walled area. There's probably some social difference, but who got to live inside and who lived outside, but we don't know what those differences are at this time. But the city and over 100 mounds were outside the walled district. So there is still a lot of special areas, high status areas outside the walled precinct as well. And at the far left we can see a depiction of the wood hens. They're a circle of posts that was used like a sun calendar to predict the different times of the year by the position of the rising sun as seen from the central observation post. See here is what we call the Birdman tablet. It's sort of the iconic artifact for Cahokia and has been used as our symbol or logo. But it's a sandstone tablet about 4 inches tall. And on the front of it has what we call the Birdman figure. It shows a man wearing a bird-like mask with a beaked nose, like a raptor, holding a wing up to one side with probably a pendant on his chest, and sort of a kilt-like, skirt-like affair underneath. And we think this is symbolic of part of the spiritual realm they believed in. On the backside it has a crosshatch pattern, which we think represents snake skin. And so we have the creatures or the symbols of the different spiritual worlds. The upper world represented by the bird, the middle world or this world represented by the man, and the backside, the underworld or lower world or beneath world represented by the snake skin. So we don't know how they use this type of stone, but we see samples of these. I'm doing a study currently on tablets, Mississippian tablets. Only a few of them have the graphics on one side, but most of them have the cross-hatching either on one or both sides. So we don't know how they used them, how they displayed them. It's one of those mysteries of Cahokia and the Mississippian world. But we're trying to understand. They don't show patterns of wear. If you're grinding something with them, some people thought, well, maybe they're sharpening bone needles for tattooing, but the lines on these are very uniform and not like the usual abraders that we find for sharpening bone tools. So there's something different going on, but they probably had some practical function as well as a symbolic function.
Mound 72 is one of the few mounds that's had extensive excavations into it at Cahokia, but also one of the most unique mounds because of what they found. What they discovered in this small ridgetop mound that's about 7 feet high, about 140 feet long, is that it sits at a different angle than most of the other mounds. And we think this is associated with the alignment of the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunset, but also may have lunar alignments as well. We're finding more and more that there are lunar associations with Mississippian sites, and we think at Cahokia as well. Well, in the excavations, they found that there were 3 smaller mounds beneath Mound 72, and that these in turn covered a number of burial groupings. University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee did the excavations from 1967 through 1971 and found that there was a series of events over about 100, maybe up to 150 years of time, maybe starting a little before 1000 AD and up until maybe as 1100 or so. But what they found, they could see that there were, again, smaller mounds underneath that had been capped over by this ridgetop mound. And they could see stains in the ground indicating where large pits had been dug. They could see the profiles of some of the smaller mounds as well. And you see the actual basket loading. They got different colored soils and piled it up to make these primary mounds, that were later covered with a darker soil to make Mound 72. What they found is that the eastern end of the mound, Dr. Melvin Fowler had predicted they might find where a big post had been that was on what he called the center line of Cahokia. And as they dug, they indeed did find where a large post had been, and that's at the far right end of the mound on the map here. And next to that, they found a very elaborate burial ritual, including a blanket of about 20,000 shell beads with a man on top, and now we found that it's a woman underneath it, his left side. We used to think it was 2 men in their 40s. Now we know it's a man and a woman, probably in their mid-20s. But the bead blanket or platform on which they're buried has kind of a bird-like shape to it. We think that, again, it's the falcon symbolism that we see so dominant in Mississippian iconography. And so in the exhibit here, we're also showing a number of the artifacts that were found adjacent to this burial of a man and a woman, and around them were probably another 10 or more people some bundle burials, people who've been previously deceased and reburied the bones with them, others who were primary burials buried with them. In this map, we're trying to show the grouping here, what we call the beaded burial complex, with the man and the woman in blue, people buried again around them. Some, again, bundle burials, some are primary burials. And associated with them, and next to them, were 7 men and women, and piled on top of them are some of the grave offerings, including some of the things we see in the exhibit here. There were 15 of these chunky stones, or game stones. It's unusual to find one, but here we found a grouping of 15 of them, in mostly Cahokia or another type of style of chunky. We found that some burials were carried there on litters made with cedar poles. These were fragments of some of the cedar poles that were found. And we got a date from one of those of around 1050 AD. And there were 2 piles of arrowheads, and it looks like they were actually probably full arrows that were buried, but the wooden shafts have rotted away. But you can see their groupings according to shape or color or style or type of stone. And we see that the chert material came from Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Wisconsin. And these are some of there are more than 750 or so in these two piles. These are some examples here of the various forms. You can see some of them are more typical of the Cahokia area, and others are more typical of the sort of Caddoan area, Arkansas and Oklahoma. And again, indicating some of the trade contexts and other types of social contexts they had with those areas. To the left are some of the original shell beads that were part of this almost 20,000 shell beads in this particular platform, this bird-shaped platform. And at the the western end of the mound was another offering that had over 36,600 in some of these shell beads, both the disc beads and barrel-shaped beads and other forms, some very small, what we call seed beads, all the way up to some that were maybe a couple inches long. So quite an unusual deposit. And here's some of the mica. There are almost 2 bushels of mica found with the ritual offering. And this is the actual raw material, not the finished product. So we sometimes feel lucky to find one little piece of it. Here we had close to 2 bushels of the raw mica that came from the southern Appalachians. And sometimes these were made into different kinds of beads and ornaments, or they might crush it to make glitter that might be applied to the body for certain ritual activities. So it probably had many, many purposes, but it certainly is not native to this area. And besides what we call the beaded burial complex, we found that there were other mass graves in Mound 72, mostly young women. A reanalysis in recent years by the University of Illinois indicates they range in age from about 12 to 25. And the biggest pit had 53 young women. There may have been a few young men in there as well, laid out in 2 rows and piled 2 deep. Other pits had 19 and 24 and 22 young women, and again, possibly a few young men as well. Another burial, which we see illustrated here, had it was about 6 feet deep, had 2 layers of burials. The bottom layer had 39 people who had just been tossed in. They weren't carefully laid out. It looked like they'd been lined up along the edge of the pit and clubbed and pushed in. A mixture of male and female, mostly male. And a couple of them had been beheaded. The skulls were down between their knees. Above them were 15 people who'd been carried there on litters or stretchers. Again, the cedar poles were forming the framework for some of those litters. And again, mixture of male and female, young and old. So we see differential burial treatment, which suggests obviously different status in life. You're treated differently in life, you're treated differently in death. In the center of our exhibit gallery, we have the recreated village. This is a life-size village showing what their houses would look like. And the mannequins that we see here are actually cast from living Indians by the artists who created them. And so we're trying to show men, women, children, adults, people of high status, commoners, people in different roles and status in life. The houses that you see are basically built by first digging a basin in the ground, sometimes about a foot or 2 deep, and around the edges of the bottom of that basin they would dig narrow trenches in which they set upright posts to form the walls of the house. And the walls were then covered with, in this case you can see cattail mats made from the leaves of the cattail plant sewn together. Sometimes they would plaster over the walls. What we call wattle and daub construction. They weave saplings around the uprights and plaster over that with clay and grass mixed together, and that helps to seal against the elements, against the weather. The roofs are covered with bundles of prairie grass, and native grass that grows about 7 or 8 feet tall, and they have overlapping bundles that are tied up the rafters, and that helps seal against the weather and the elements as well. So a house might last about 10 years or so before it had to be rebuilt. The part of the wood that's in the ground might start to decay, and they wanted to reinforce works that are rebuilt. We often see in our excavations that's the same spot of land sometimes has 3 or 4 different houses built sequentially. So maybe the same family, their generations would have that property, and that was where they built their house several times. We're showing a woman who was a potter. That was probably mostly a female kind of activity, digging up the clay, mixing burned mussel shell crushed into powder with the clay for tempering, and then shaping it, coiling it, and then using tools to shape it and their hands to shape it. Then decorations are often sometimes around the shoulders of some of these vessels. Some were plain, some were more of a darker, almost black color. Some had a red slip on them. So you see different styles, but these are styles that are typically Mississippian that are represented here. Behind her we see a warrior, a man with a bow and some arrows in his belt. And we know that warfare again was common during the Mississippian times, but also hunting was important. We're hunting deer and other animals. So it was probably more of a male-oriented part of their culture, the hunting and the gathering and the warfare. As we walk through the village here, we can see some other structures and some other people involved in some of the daily activities. We can see here a young woman grinding corn on a stone, grinding stone with another stone in her hand. Corn was very important to these people. They were growing lots of other food too, other kinds of crops, but starting around 900 AD is when we start to see corn becoming a very important part of the Mississippian diet. Beyond her, you can see her mother cooking over a small fire. Probably a lot of the cooking was done outside. There may have been special buildings that were used for some other cooking functions as well, but we don't very often see a lot of evidence of fire pits in some of the houses, so we think a lot of that was, the cooking all was done outside. Around the house here we can see some other utensils, I guess you'd call them. Here we have a mortar and a pestle, a wooden one made out of the trunk of a tree for pounding the corn kernels. Besides grinding, they sometimes would pound them into making a flour. Some other, as you go to the right of the door, you can see there's a process of making a wooden bowl by burning and scraping and charring and scraping out the charred area until you got the bowl to the approximate size and shape that you wanted. Beyond, we can see an elder man who's talking to somebody in the distance, and a pile of logs, probably his son or the male of this family group was probably out cutting trees to be used for construction and for other firewood and for other purposes. So we're trying to show a variety of, again, activities, again, young and old, and male and female, and the various gender roles that they had in their society. As we come around to our left here, you can see children playing. The young boy has taken his sister's little cattail doll, and she's chasing after him to get it back. Kids are kids in all ages and all times, so involved in play and other activities. They also would be learning their roles in society, with the boy following the males and learning what was expected of him as a male in the society, and the young girl for the female role in their society as well. Then we have an elevated building here. It's sort of a granary. We've seen some evidence that here when we were digging before this museum was built. Right about this location, we did see evidence of what appeared to be an elevated structure. Of course, the buildings are gone. We just see the post holes in the ground, but the way they were arranged, the size and the positioning looked like it had been an above-ground building. And this is where they would store a lot of the grains and seeds and crops and corn and other food items, and it's elevated to help protect from creatures getting into it, although it does happen occasionally. Below you can see a dog. The dog was the only kind of domesticated animal they had. And they were used not only as companions, but also as the village scavengers. They'd eat up a lot of the scraps. They would also be used in hunting. They'd be used for guard dogs for warning of anybody approaching. So dogs, like dogs today, had multiple functions in their society. Beyond that, we see a young man who was butchering a deer. It's been hunted elsewhere, but brought into the site, so it's already been disemboweled. So he's preparing to butcher it. Cut off the legs and to get the hide out, so that can be tanned and used for clothing. You can see he's wearing a loincloth, which is probably a very typical type of garment for most of the males in their society. As we go along, we can see they've got a drying rack where the strips of venison are drying and fish are drying. They used a lot of sun drying. Sometimes they might also have a smoky fire underneath the rack to help cure and preserve the food items for storage so they could be used later in the year. You notice in the room we're standing that the walls are actually mirrors. So you're seeing a reflection in the distance of other houses, but they're actually the same houses we're standing next to in here. So the idea was to create a room like this with this kind of mirrored walls to give you an idea of what it'd be like standing in the middle of the city of Cahokia when it was a busy and occupied place. As we go along, we have a young boy here who's heating some rocks. Behind him is a sweat lodge, a circular structure about 10 feet in diameter. And we see these starting to appear during the Mississippian period. And as we go along, we'll see that into an interior view, but this is where mainly men in the society, but women may have had their own as well, would go take these hot rocks inside, and then they would sprinkle water on them to create steam. So it's basically a steam bath, and to help cleanse the soul as well as the body in ritual, spiritual activity. This part of the diorama shows what we call a sub-chief and a flint napper. The sub-chief, say it's a person of high status because he has the shell gorget around his neck. He's got copper ear spools. He's got a woven fabric kilt and sash. So people of higher rank would often have the fabric clothing as opposed to the buckskin loincloth like the flint napper is wearing. But the flint napper is probably a very high status person as well. And both of them, you can see, have tattoos, facial tattoos and body tattoos on the sub-chief. But the flint napper has now made a knife that he's trading to the sub-chief, and the sub-chief has in his hands some lumps of salt. Salt was a very important trade commodity. There are salt springs south of this area in southern Illinois and southeastern Missouri, where probably most of the salt comes from seeps or salt springs, where they would evaporate the salt water in large sort of shallow dish-like ceramic vessels. And sometimes they'd have fires under or around that to help accelerate the evaporation process to leave the residue, the salt residue. But it was very important in their diet, as for most people around the world. It is today. Salt was a very important commodity. And the flint napper was someone who usually probably high status in the society because of his skills in creating tools and weapons. Here you can see he's made several hoes that are out in front of him on the ground and on his leg. He's using a deer antler and a billet to strike off the flakes from the chert or flint to make the tools, arrowheads, and other things. So he has a whole toolkit there sitting next to him, as well as flakes that he's going to use to make some arrowheads and other knives and implements. So he was a very important person in their society, and they had to go sometimes great distances to get the chert they needed. Probably about 80% of what we find here at Cahokia is that, like the hose in front of them, are made out of that white colored to tan colored flint that came from the south of St. Louis. But we also see flint coming from parts of southern Illinois, especially for making hose, where it occurs in large flat slabs, but also we find in excavations here, especially in Mound 72, we found arrowheads made out of chert or flint that came from Wisconsin, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, as well as Illinois. So Cahokia is kind of situated along the core of the trade network, using the river systems. The Mississippi, the Missouri, the Illinois rivers all converge near here, and these were main transportation routes, and so they used those to go great distances, but they had overland trails as well to get to the places they needed and get the resources they needed. So this kind of gives an idea of some of the activities you might see in one of Cahokia's neighborhoods. Population here. We'll be going up Monk's Mound next, but first I want to point out a couple other things here. As we look to the south, you can see a mound across the road. That's Mound 51. The landowner, and that used to be a subdivision of houses, sold the mound for fill back in the 60s. University of Illinois was able to do some limited excavations, and they could see a couple building stages, what was left of the mound. But beneath it, what was most interesting, on that side of the road and this side of the road, was a borrow pit that had been dug out probably to help build Monk's Mound or help build the Grand Plaza. And it was filled in fairly rapidly with debris from feasting that took place out on the plaza. And archaeologists have reanalyzed all that material and come up with some very interesting conclusions about the number of deer and things represented. They were finding preserved material that we don't normally find in this environment. They were getting plant remains, they were getting thatch, they were getting mats, wood, bark, even berries were found, and insect remains. And so it really gave us some insights into how they were utilizing the environment here. And again, indications of the extent of some of their local hunting and gathering and agricultural practices. Beyond that, there's 3 other mounds. And the first one after that, Mound 50, I did some excavations in 1986 and 87. It's a low, sort of dome-shaped mound. We found several large intrusive pits into it, including 2 very big post pits. So maybe a lot of these mounds had posts sticking out of them as well. The farthest one you can see, the Murdoch Mound, has 2 terraces, one facing out towards the Grand Plaza. And Harriet Smith dug that one in 1941 when the subdivision was starting to go in here. And she could see that it did have indeed a couple building stages and was probably covered with a black clay. But even predating the mound, there were ceremonial structures. There was a large circular structure and a cross-shaped building. They're very rare. Only a few of these have ever been found in the Mississippian world. And so we show then that there's ceremonial activity taking place there even before the mound was built there, or continuation of ritual activity. We are now standing on the third terrace of Monk's Mound, about probably 97 feet up right now. And behind this, up this direction, is the 4th terrace, about 3 feet higher, or a total of 100 feet above the floodplain here. On this 3rd terrace, back in the 1830s, Amos Hill built a farmhouse up here and several outbuildings around it. And he's the one that cut the notch over here that's passed to come up here to the top. And he actually dug a well on the 2nd terrace right below us here. It's on the back end where those people in the distance are, is where the big temple structure will be. We'll be going back there in a few minutes. If we look in the opposite direction, to the south, you can see the twin mound. So straight ahead is a flat top mound. Between the trees and to your right, it's kind of hard to see, it's kind of brush covered right now. We're in the process of removing the trees from the mound. It's a conical mound. So you can see this kind of pairing several places throughout the site. And we think it's a mortuary complex, with the building that would have been on the flat top mound being a charnel structure, and perhaps the burials of important people in the conical mound adjacent to it. But we haven't dug there, so we don't know that for certain. But based on work at other Mississippian sites, we think that's probably the situation. And between here and there, the twin mounds, and to the right and to the left of us, is the Grand Plaza. It covers about 40 acres, and it was actually artificially built up, sometimes as much as 3 feet or so. The original swale and ridge topography was filled in, and they capped it with a kind of a sandier loam to provide, I guess, good footing. That's where you would not see many buildings out there. There are a couple mounds out there, but that's where they had the public gatherings and festivals and games and markets like we saw in some of the illustrations. As you go farther to the west, you can see the downtown St. Louis and the Arch. And that's where one of the major satellites of Cahokia used to be, about 26 or 7 mounds just north of the Arch. And on this side of the river in East St. Louis, probably another 50 mounds. And most of those mounds were destroyed as those cities were growing in the 1860s, 50s, 60s, 70s. The last mound in St. Louis went down about 1870. But they're all part of this Mississippian complex we call Greater Cahokia, including these 3 primary mound centers, plus smaller communities all around, as we've seen in some of the maps. If you look straight to the west, you can see another mound out in the middle of the field called Merrill Mound. There have been excavations on this side of it over a number of years, and kind of hidden by the trees is Sand Prairie Lane. When that was relocated in the 1960s to go over the interstate, that's where they found evidence of compounds, these large walled enclosures that probably sealed off, certain ceremonial activities. First, a huge round structure, or maybe a couple of them, and then later rectangular ones. And some of these had bastions on them as well. Not as evenly spaced as we saw in the stockade or palisade, but still a similar sort of circular variety like we saw with the first palisade. And at the far end of that field is where the reconstruction of the wood hen is located. And excavations up here from the mid-60s through about 1971 by Washington University out of St. Louis. And they found evidence of a huge building here, again almost 100 feet long, maybe almost 50 feet wide. You can see where the trenches had been dug to set the post in, and the large center post to help support the roof. There was a fenced courtyard around it. Out in front of that big post that more or less marked the center of their city and link again the underworld, the middle world, and the upper world symbolically. The building was maybe as much as 30, 40 feet tall, and the seat of power for Cahokia. Maybe the paramount chief was here, maybe he lived here, maybe they met here with the council of elders and priests, greeting dignitaries from other places. So it was a very important location, very sacred spot. And it sat back here. It's bigger than the gravel area that you see, but maybe it come out almost to where we're standing, but about the same length. So a massive structure up here.